a king discovered he was sterile, and his kingdom held its breath. Then a rejected Omega appeared at his palace gates with 2 children, and the world he thought he understood stopped making sense entirely. She was not supposed to survive the rejection, not the way she did intact, purposeful, raising 2 small wolves in a mountain village with her head down and her hands busy and the mate bond buried so deep inside her chest that only she knew it had never actually closed. He was not supposed to still be searching for her. He had a queen. He had a throne. He had an entire court constructed around the choice he made 5 years ago when he stood in front of his council and let an Omega walk out of his life because it was easier than explaining to powerful men why she mattered. His wolf had not forgiven him for that. It never would. For 5 years they existed in separate silences, she in the cold of the northern provinces, he in the gilded isolation of a crown that was slowly losing its succession. Neither of them knew that the distance between them was not coincidence. It had been purchased, carefully arranged by a woman who smiled at the right moments and kept her secrets in places no one thought to look. Until a healer arrived at the southern gate one winter afternoon with 2 children who had a king's eyes, and everything Seraphine had built began, very quietly, to come apart. To understand how love survives what should have destroyed it, we have to go back to the night it almost did. The cottage smelled of pine resin and tallow candles, and the faintly medicinal sweetness of dried mountain herbs. It was a good smell. Mara had spent 6 months making it so. She fed the last document to the fire and watched it go. The paper curled at the edges, then blackened, then came apart in glowing flakes that rose and died before they reached the chimney. Her name, her academy certification, the single formal record that placed Mara Valdris inside the Silver Throne Court's healing program gone in under a minute, the way important things always seemed to go. She did not watch it finish burning. She turned back to the table. The boys were sleeping in the carry basket she had lined with wool and herb-soaked cloth. Both of them. Still, for once, their small faces slack and their breathing even and slow. They had their father's jaw already. Even now, 6 weeks old and barely the length of her forearm, she could see it, the particular set of the bone, the way the left one frowned in his sleep, as if working through a problem. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed until the ache subsided. It never fully subsided. Healers knew why. A mate bond severed by rejection but not by death left a wound that could be managed, scar tissued over with time and discipline, but never fully closed. She had treated women with the same injury. She had held their hands and spoken to them honestly about what recovery looked like. She understood, clinically, exactly what was happening in the left side of her chest every time she forgot to keep her guard up. Understanding it did not make it smaller. Both strong, said the midwife from the doorway. Her name was Hesta, and she was 60 years old and had delivered half the children in Ashenford province and kept harder secrets than this one. The big one more than the little one, but both of them strong past what an Omega pairing ought to produce. I know, Mara said. The scent. Hesta said it carefully, the way she said things she wished she didn't have to say. It'll need suppressing, daily, until they're old enough to manage it themselves. You know the compound. Clover root, white ash, river sedge. She had already prepared 3 months' supply. It sat on the shelf beside the carry basket in small linen packets, each one labeled in her own handwriting. I know. Hesta crossed the room and stood beside her, looking down at the sleeping boys. Her expression was not soft exactly. It was the look of a woman who had seen enough of the world to understand what this particular situation was going to cost. What will you call them? Mara had been thinking about that since before they were born. She had a list. She had crossed everything off the list except 2 names that had belonged to her mother's brothers, men she had loved and lost before she was 10, men who had nothing to do with the Silver Throne or anyone in it. Rowan, she said, and Eli. Hesta nodded. And the family name? Ashford, her mother's name, her grandmother's name before that, a name that had never once appeared in any court document. They're Omega-registered foster wards. I'm their care provider. She had already written the paperwork. It was drying on the desk. Their mother died in transit, no surviving family. Hesta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were the best student the academy ever produced, you know. Before." "I know," Morris said again. It was easier than the alternatives. She did not sleep that night. She organized the cottage instead, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided that feeling things will have to wait until there is more time. She arranged the herb shelves by function. She cataloged the supply chest. She set up the small examination table by the window and thought about how to advertise her services to a village that did not yet know it needed a healer. By morning, she had a plan. By the end of the first month, she had patients. By the end of the first year, she had more than she could comfortably manage alone. And she had learned that the work, if she let it, was large enough to fill all the space where other things used to live. She let it. The boys grew. Rowan grew faster, louder, more inclined to climb things that were not designed to be climbed. Eli grew quieter and more watchful, with a habit of studying strangers' faces that made adults uncomfortable and charmed them anyway. They both had their father's gray eyes. Storm gray, the color of the sky before something broke open. She did not look at them in lamplight if she could help it. 5 years passed. They passed the way years do when you are busy and purposeful, and very carefully not thinking about certain things quickly, without warning, in a series of ordinary days that only felt significant when she looked back at them. She was treating a child's fever on a Tuesday afternoon in deep winter when she heard the knock at the clinic door. She assumed it was another patient. They came at all hours now. She had stopped locking the door. It was the merchant from the Valley Road. He came through twice a year with dry goods and capital news, and he had the look of a man who had been turning a piece of information over for several days and hadn't decided yet whether to deliver it. He decided the king, he said, had no heir. 3 physicians and no answers. The noble houses were gathering like weather on the horizon, and the court was fracturing along every seam it had. Mara thanked him, gave him a tincture for his joints, and returned to her patient. She did not think about what the news meant, not yet. But that night, for the first time in 2 years, her wolf pressed close to her thoughts. Not speaking, not demanding, only listening, the way it did when it sensed that something important was about to change. The merchant came back 3 weeks after his first visit. Mara knew something was wrong before he knocked. She heard his footsteps on the road too fast, too uneven for a man who usually moved with the unhurried patience of someone who had been walking the same routes for 20 years. She set down the poultice she was mixing and wiped her hands on her work cloth and went to the door. He stood on the step with snow on his shoulders and his breath coming in short white clouds. His name was Brennan, and he was not a man given to alarm. That was what made the look on his face so precise in its meaning. "There are men in the valley," he said, asking about a healer. She stepped back and let him in. He told her what he knew, which was not much but was enough. 2 men, well-mounted, not from any local house. They had been moving from village to village since the first snowfall, asking after an Omega woman who had left the capital 5 years ago. They were also asking about children. 2 boys, unusually strong for their classification, somewhere in the northern provinces. Mara listened to all of it without moving. "They showed coin," Brennan said. "Real coin. The kind that makes people remember things they might otherwise forget." "How far behind you are they?" "A day, maybe less." She thanked him. She gave him a jar of the joint tincture he always left without asking for, and she walked him back to the door, and she waited until she could no longer hear his horse on the road. Then she stood in the quiet of her clinic for approximately 30 seconds and allowed herself to think through every option she had. The way she would approach a difficult diagnosis without sentiment, without panic, with only the question of what was true and what could be done about it. North was not possible. The high passes were already closed, and the temperature was dropping toward the kind of cold that killed people who made mistakes. East meant the contested border territory, 2 children on foot, no papers that would hold up to a checkpoint inspection. West was open farmland and nowhere to disappear into. That left south. The road south was maintained. It was warm enough to travel. It had villages spaced at reasonable intervals, and it led, eventually, to the capital, which was the last place anyone hunting her on the Queen's orders would think to look for her. because no sane woman walked directly into the house of the person trying to destroy her. Mara had not always been sane, exactly, but she had always been logical. And the logic, stripped of everything else, was simple. The boys needed to live. Everything else was secondary. She went to get them from Hesta's house. Rowan was in the middle of an argument with a fence post when she arrived. He had strong opinions about fence posts, as he had strong opinions about most things. Eli was sitting on the step watching him with the patient expression of a child who had long since accepted that his brother was simply going to be like this. "We're going on a trip," Mara said. Rowan immediately wanted to know where. Eli immediately started looking at her face with those gray eyes of his, reading something in it that she had not said aloud. He had always done that. She tried not to think too hard about where he had gotten the habit. "South," she said. "It's warmer." She did not go back to the clinic. There was nothing left there she couldn't replace, and the only thing she needed she had already prepared for exactly this possibility, packed into a single carry bag that had lived under the examination table for the past 8 months. Ever since Brennan's first visit with news from the capital H, had settled something cold in the base of her stomach. She had known, on some level. She had simply been waiting to know for certain. They left before the moon was fully up. The road south was hard-packed and gray in the dark, and the boys were tired enough that they leaned against her without complaint as they walked. She kept their herb-soaked wraps fresh and tight. She kept her own pace steady. She did not look back. Behind her, the clinic sat dark and still with the hearth banked low. When the hunters reached it, less than an hour later, the embers were still orange at their core. The taller of the two men pressed his palm flat against the stone and held it there. Warm. He turned to look at the road. There was only one direction with tracks in the new fallen snow, and they were fresh enough that the edges had not yet softened. The second man was already moving toward his horse. "I'll report back," the first said. "You follow the road." He did not wait for agreement. He turned his mount north, toward the capital, toward the woman who was paying them to be thorough. The second man rode south, and Mara, a mile ahead on the dark road with her son's hands in hers, did not know that the distance between her and safety was already closing. They reached the southern gate as the afternoon light was failing. The city rose up ahead of them through the gray winter haze walls of pale stone, torches already lit along the ramparts, the distant sound of bells marking the hour. Mara had not seen it in 5 years. She had not let herself picture it. Now it was simply there, large and real and unchanged, and she kept her eyes on the gate and her pace steady and did not allow herself to feel anything about that. Rowan wanted to know if there were horses inside. "Probably," she said. "Big ones?" "Walk faster." The gate was manned by 4 soldiers and a checkpoint clerk bundled against the cold behind a portable writing desk. Mara joined the queue of traders and travelers waiting to enter and pulled her cloak tighter and kept the twins close. She had her story ready. Domestic medicine worker, newly contracted to the palace infirmary. 2 Omega-registered foster wards in her care. Her paperwork was clean. She had spent 3 of the 5 road days preparing it at village inns, writing in the careful hand the academy had trained into her until it no longer felt like her own. The queue moved. She stepped forward. The soldier who stopped her was young. He looked at her papers with the expression of someone doing a job he had done 1,000 times, and then something shifted in his face. He looked up. She recognized him at the same moment he recognized her. Edric. He had been 17, posted to a provincial checkpoint, running a fever so high she had packed him in cold compresses for 2 days before it broke. He had cried once, when he thought she was asleep. She had pretended not to hear. He was 22 now, taller, with a corporal's stripe on his sleeve. His eyes went from her face to the boys and back to her face, and she watched him decide something in the space of a single breath. "Medicine worker," he said, in the flat voice of a man reading from a document. "2 dependents. Palace infirmary placement." "That's correct," she said. He stamped her papers without another word and handed them back. His hand was completely steady. She moved through the gate and did not look back. The lower courtyard was crowded with the end-of-day traffic supply carts, off-duty guards, servants crossing between buildings with their arms full of linens and crates. The intake processing hall was on the far side. its entrance marked by a lamp above the door. Mara fixed her eyes on that lamp and walked toward it. She was halfway across the courtyard when her wolf went rigid. Not a sound, not a warning, just a sudden, terrible stillness. The way an animal freezes when it scents something it has not encountered in a very long time, and does not know yet whether to run or stay. She stopped walking. Across the courtyard, on the upper path that connected the great hall to the north wing, a man was walking with 2 advisors at his heels. He was tall, dark-haired. He moved the way men do when they have spent their entire lives in rooms that rearrange themselves around their presence, not arrogantly, but with a bone-deep certainty that space would accommodate him. Kaelin. She had known she would see him here. She had prepared for it. She had told herself on the road that 5 years was enough to make a person into something manageable. A fact. A history. A wound that had healed to scar tissue, functional if not entirely comfortable. She had been wrong. The ache that moved through her chest was not old. It was immediate. Her wolf pressed hard against her thoughts, straining forward with a recognition so fierce it took everything she had to hold still. He did not look up. He was speaking to one of his advisors, his head slightly turned, his attention elsewhere. He would pass the far end of the courtyard and go through the north wing door, and she would walk into the processing hall, and that would be the end of it. His stride broke. Just slightly. Just for 1 step. Like a man who has caught a scent on the wind and cannot place it. He did not stop. He did not turn. But the break was there, and she saw it, and her wolf knew exactly what it meant. She walked into the processing hall and focused on her breathing. The intake administrator was a tired woman who did not look up from her ledger. She recorded Mara's classification, assigned her to the lower infirmary, and noted the 2 Omega-registered children with the minimal interest of someone who had processed 100 similar arrangements. She gave Mara a wing assignment, a meal voucher, and directions to the servants' dormitory. 2 weeks, Mara told herself, settling the boys into the small room with its narrow cot and its single window looking out over the kitchen garden. She needed 2 weeks long enough to locate Seraphine's hunter, find an exit route, plan the next step. Rowan climbed immediately onto the cot. Eli stood at the window and looked out at the dark courtyard below, very still, in the way he always was when something was happening that he didn't yet have words for. "Are we safe?" he asked. "Yes," she said. It was almost true. She slept poorly and was already awake when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, a servant, moving quickly, carrying a message by the sound of the paper folding. The steps paused outside the room next door, then continued. In the morning, the dormitory's senior attendant came to find her. The royal physician, the attendant said, wanted the new infirmary medicine worker to report for a skills assessment. The king's orders. 2 days later, Mara stood in the royal physician's examination room and answered questions she had been trained to answer 8 years ago in a classroom 3 floors above this one. She did not let herself think about that. Dr. Fenwick was a compact man with ink-stained fingers and the particular manner of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by anything. He sat across from her at his cluttered desk with a case file open between them and worked through his assessment with methodical patience. Standard questions, standard dosage scenarios, the kind of evaluation designed to confirm a classification rather than test its limits. She answered accurately, not brilliantly. She was here to be competent, not remarkable. Then he pushed the chronic pain file across the desk. She read it once. She read it again. The notation at the bottom was Fenwick's own hand. A standard anti-inflammatory compound, moderate dose, ongoing. Reasonable, if the diagnosis was correct. The diagnosis was not correct. "Your dosage assumes joint inflammation," she said. "But the symptom pattern here, the asymmetry, the morning severity, the way it doesn't respond to heat, that's not inflammation. That's a nerve root issue. The compound you've prescribed won't touch it." Fenwick looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. "Show me," he said. She walked him through it. He asked 2 questions and stopped asking. He made a note and set the file aside and reached for the next one, and his expression had shifted into something harder to read. Not skepticism, exactly. More like recalibration. The healing touch demonstration came at the end. He had a patient with a soft tissue injury, recently arrived, and he asked Mara to assess. She pressed her fingers gently along the affected area and let the warmth come. The particular gift she had spent 5 years telling herself was nothing unusual, just skilled palpation, just good technique. The patient's breathing slowed. The inflammation visibly reduced under her hands within 30 seconds. Fenwick went very still. "That is not a standard Omega gift," he said quietly. "I've had a long time to practice," she said. He was drawing breath to press further when the door opened. She knew before she turned. Her wolf went flat against her thoughts, utterly silent, the way it did when it was overwhelmed past the point of language. The warmth in the room changed. The air changed. Every fine hair along her arms lifted. "I won't interrupt," said Kaylin's voice from behind her. "I only need the Harwick file." "Third shelf," Fenwick said. She kept her attention on the patient, kept her hands exactly where they were. Behind her, she heard him cross the room, heard the soft friction of a file being drawn from the shelf, heard him stop. He did not leave. The back of her neck knew he was watching. Her wolf pressed upward, straining, and she forced it back down with everything she had. Her hands did not shake. She was very proud of that. "You can go, Devon," Fenwick said to the patient. The patient left. The room was quiet. She had no patient between herself and the moment anymore. She turned. He was standing by the shelving with the file in his hand and his eyes on her, and she had told herself on the road, in the dormitory, during 2 sleepless nights on a narrow cot that she had prepared for this specific reality of him, close enough to see clearly, with no crowd between them and no distance to hide behind. She had not prepared. There was no preparing for this. His jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes moved over her face with an attention so focused it felt like pressure against her skin. She looked away first. She always would. "Efficient resource allocation," he said to Fenwick. "She should be in the royal wing." Fenwick said carefully, "That's a significant reclassification." "Yes," said Kaylin. He left. Fenwick looked at the closed door for a moment, then looked at Mara. Whatever he saw in her face, he chose not to ask about it. He simply picked up his pen and began filling out the transfer form. The afternoon was pale and cold. The herb garden bare, except for the winter rosemary and a few stubborn gray-green plants that refused to acknowledge the season. Mara brought the boys out after their lessons because they needed air and she needed something to do with her hands, and the garden was far enough from the royal wing that she had allowed herself to believe it was safe. She was trimming dead growth from the rosemary when she heard footsteps on the path. She recognized the weight of them. Her wolf recognized them faster. Kaylin came through the garden gate with no advisor behind him for once alone, walking slowly, apparently in need of nothing more than a moment outside. He did not see her immediately. Then he did. He stopped. Eli was sitting on the garden wall 10 feet away, watching a sparrow with the focused patience that was entirely his own. Rowan was crouching in the dirt near Mara's feet, conducting what appeared to be a negotiation with a beetle. Kaylin looked at Rowan. He went still in a way that had nothing to do with courtesy. Rowan looked up at him with those gray eyes, storm gray, the color of the sky before something broke open, and said, with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to be subtle, "Are you the king?" "The first am," Kaylin said. "Mama said not to bother important people." Kaylin crouched down, bringing himself level with Rowan, and studied the boy's face with an expression Mara could not watch directly. She looked at her hands on the rosemary stems. She heard him ask Rowan what he was doing, heard Rowan launch into a detailed account of the beetle situation, heard Kaylin respond with the grave seriousness the subject apparently deserved. She did not look up until the conversation had run its natural course, and Kaylin had straightened and taken his leave with a quiet word she didn't catch. She waited until his footsteps had faded from the path. "Mama," Rowan said, not looking up from his beetle. "Yes. That man smells like us." Her hands went still on the rosemary branch. Every word she might have said dissolved before it reached her mouth. She stood there in the winter garden, holding a dead stem, and understood for the first time exactly how little time she had left. The summons came just before the evening bells. Fenwick delivered it himself, which told her it had not passed through the usual channels. He stood in her infirmary doorway with his coat still on and said simply that the king had a tension injury in his upper back and had requested her specifically by name. Then he looked at the middle distance for a moment and added that the royal wing corridor was well lit and that she should have no difficulty finding the study. He did not look at her face when he said it. She understood that to be a kindness. The royal wing smelled of beeswax and old stone, and the faint ghost of wood smoke from a dozen fireplaces burning against the winter cold. Mara walked it with her kit in her hands and her posture controlled and her wolf grinding low in her chest. Furious at the restraint she was imposing on it, straining toward the warmth and the scent that grew stronger with every step. She knocked. He answered himself. The study was firelit and smaller than she expected a working room, not a formal one, with books stacked at irregular angles and a desk layered in correspondence, and a single chair pulled close to the hearth. The room felt like a place where the performance of being king was occasionally set down. She had not expected that. She filed it away behind her professional composure and focused on the task. The injury was real. She had half wondered, but the tension knotted across his right shoulder blade was genuine. The particular hardness of muscle that had been compensating for something for weeks, maybe longer. She worked in silence, her fingers moving with the focused precision that always steadied her when everything else was pulling in different directions. He bore it without complaint. That, too, she had not expected. "Your son's," he said after several minutes. "The older one. He is quite confident in his opinions." "He has always been that way," she said. "And the younger?" She paused for half a breath. "He watches, he thinks before he speaks. A beat. He will be the more dangerous of the two, eventually." Something in his shoulders shifted, not tension, but the quality of his attention. She kept working. "How long have you been practicing?" he asked. 8 years. The number came out before she could moderate it. 8 years since her first academy placement, the real count, the true one. She felt him calculate something in the silence that followed. "That is a long time," he said. "Where did you train?" Her hands did not stop moving, her voice did not change. "A court-affiliated program," she said, "in the north." It was not precisely a lie. The academy was court-affiliated. It simply was not located in the north. He let a beat pass, and she could feel that he had noticed the evasion and had made a choice about whether to press it. He chose not to. The choice itself was worse, somehow, than if he had pushed. "I find your presence steadying," he said quietly. "I cannot explain that. I am aware it is an unusual thing to say to someone you have known for less than a fortnight." Mara's hands stilled for one full second. Then she resumed. "I don't require an explanation," she said. "My wolf has been quiet since you arrived." His voice was careful, not confessional, exactly more like a man reading aloud from a document he is still deciding whether to sign. "It has not been quiet in a long time. 3 years, perhaps, since a border ambush on the eastern road. A stranger helped me." A pause. "I have never been able to account for the quality of that memory." The fire crackled. Somewhere outside the window, the night wind moved against the stone. She did not breathe. She did not move. She stood with her hands 3 inches from his shoulder and understood with absolute clarity that she was standing on the thinnest possible surface and that it would hold her weight only if she did not shift. He turned, not fully, just enough to bring his face into her peripheral vision, enough that she could see the line of his jaw without looking at him directly, the particular way he held himself when he was choosing his next words with care. His hand came up. His thumb brushed her jaw. A single pass, slow, removing something, a smudge of herb oil she hadn't known was there. His touch was warm, warmer than she had let herself remember. He did not pull back. The space between them had become something specific, something that had weight and temperature and the particular quality of a thing balanced precisely on its edge. She was aware of his throat, aware of the way his breathing had changed, slowed, deepened. Her wolf was no longer making sound. It had gone absolutely, entirely still, the stillness of something that has stopped hoping and started knowing. He leaned forward. 1 inch. She stood up. "I should go," she said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. The boys will need checking on. He did not argue. He did not ask her to stay. But she felt his gaze on her back all the way to the door, steady and unreadable, the way it had been in the courtyard and the examination room and every accidental crossing of paths in between. The corridor outside was cool and quiet and merciful. She pressed her back against the stone wall and closed her eyes and waited for the shaking in her hands to stop. It had almost stopped when she opened her eyes. At the far end of the corridor, perfectly still in the lamplight, stood Seraphine. The queen was not passing through. She was not in transit. She stood with her hands folded and her pale eyes fixed directly on Mara, and on her face was an expression that Mara's wolf recognized before her conscious mind did. Not anger. Not surprise. Confirmation. The summons came the following morning, delivered by a palace attendant who said only that the queen wished to speak with her at her earliest convenience. Mara understood what that meant. Earliest convenience, in the language of queens, meant now. Seraphine's receiving room was on the upper floor of the west wing, a room of pale stone and tall windows that let in the winter light without any of its warmth. The furniture was beautiful and deliberately uncomfortable. Every surface was clear of clutter. It was a room designed to communicate that the woman who occupied it had nothing to hide and nothing to fear, and Mara recognized the performance for what it was, even as she stepped inside and heard the door close behind her. Seraphine stood at the window with her back to the room. She did not turn immediately. That was also deliberate. "Mara Valdres," she said, quietly, conversationally. "The way you said the name of something you had already decided the fate of." The cold moved through Mara's chest like a blade going in clean. Seraphine turned then, and her face was composed and pleasant and utterly without mercy. She crossed to the low table near the window, where a single document lay waiting, and she picked it up with the unhurried patience of a woman who had been planning this exact moment for some time. "You trained at the Royal Academy," Seraphine said. "You were there 5 years ago. You left the night of the choosing ceremony and no one came looking, because I made certain no one would." She set the document down on the table between them. "You have been living in Ashenford Province. You arrived here 4 days ago on a fraudulent service classification." She smiled. It arrived a half-second before it should have. "I don't want a scene," she said. "One never wants scenes. They're exhausting for everyone involved." The document was a palace exit authorization. Mara could see the official seal from where she stood. Transfer of service worker and 2 dependent minors to the Eastern Province work settlement, effective within 48 hours. "The alternative," Seraphine said, "is a formal accusation of fraudulent palace entry, which is a criminal matter. The processing time alone would be inconvenient for your children." Mara looked at the document. She looked at Seraphine's face. She picked up the paper. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. She walked back to the servant quarters through corridors that felt narrower than they had an hour ago. The document folded against her palm, and she sat down on the narrow bed and stared at the wall for a long moment before she began, methodically, to pack. She had done this before. The muscle memory was intact: what to take, what to leave, how to fit 12 days of survival into a single carry bag. Her hands moved through the familiar sequence, and her mind worked the problem with the same clinical precision she applied to everything that could not be survived through feeling. Eastern Province. Work settlement. The boys would be warm. She could find a way to practice there, eventually. She could start again. She had started again before. Fenwick appeared in the doorway. He looked at the bag. He looked at her face. He did not ask what had happened, because he had been watching people survive impossible things for 30 years, and he recognized the particular quality of this silence. "Is there anything I can do?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "No," she said. "Thank you." He left. He did not go far. She could hear him in the corridor outside, moving with the particular slowness of a man who was not yet ready to accept that a situation was finished. She reached for the second bag. The boys' things. Eli's carved wooden sparrow that he slept with. Rowan's spare boots, already worn through at the left toe. She was folding Rowan's extra shirt when the connecting door opened and Eli padded in from the room where he and his brother had been napping, blinking and quiet and warm from sleep. He stood in the lamplight in his stocking feet and looked at the half-packed bag on the bed, and then looked at Mara with those gray eyes that she could never quite hold without flinching. The lamplight did this sometimes, hit a certain angle, caught the line of his jaw, the particular set of his brow above those storm-gray eyes, and produced in her a recognition so precise and so devastating that her body simply stopped. She held Rowan's shirt and did not move. Eli said nothing. He came and leaned against her side with the easy trust of a child who had never had reason to doubt that she would hold steady, and she put her arm around him and stayed very still, and the folded shirt stayed in her hands, and the bag stayed half-packed on the bed. She sat there a long time. The lamp burned down a quarter of its length. Outside the window, the palace settled into its evening sound spells, distant voices, the creak of the old stone contracting in the cold. She looked at her son's face. She put the shirt down. She stood up and went to the doorway and said, quietly, to the corridor where Fenwick was still waiting, "I need you to carry a message to the king." He turned. His expression did not change, but she heard the particular quality of attention that came into his silence. "Tell him I need 30 minutes, she said. "Before dawn, privately." She paused. "Tell him it is important that he comes alone." Fenwick looked at her for a moment with the steady gaze of a man who understood that the next few hours were going to be significant. Then he put on his coat and went. The garden was dark and cold and smelled of frozen earth and old rosemary, and Kaelin was already there when Mara arrived. He was standing with his back to the gate, hands at his sides, and he turned when he heard her footsteps on the path. His eyes went to the carry sling first, to the two small shapes asleep against her chest, their breathing slow and even, their faces hidden in the shadows of the wool wrap. He looked at them for a long moment before he looked at her. She had spent the walk from the dormitory deciding on the order of things, what to say first, what to hold back until the right moment. She had organized it the way she organized a difficult case, by priority, by consequence, by what the situation could bear. She stopped 2 feet from him. "My name is Mara Valdris," she said. "I was a student at the Royal Healing Academy 5 years ago. I was in this palace on the night of the choosing ceremony." She watched his face. 10 seconds. Possibly less. She saw the calculation move through him like weather. The dates, the timeline, the specific weight of a name he had not heard spoken in 5 years pressing against everything he thought he knew about the shape of his own history. She watched him arrive at the edge of the understanding and stop there, holding it. "The bond," he said, very quietly. "Never closed," she said. "I treated myself for it for 2 years before I accepted that it wasn't going to. You can't close a rejection bond when the other half of it is still living." Something moved across his jaw. A muscle, tightening and releasing. She reached into her cloak and pulled out the exit authorization and held it out to him. He took it. He read the first line. Her name, the work settlement, the Queen's seal at the bottom, and tore it in half. Clean through. He did not finish reading it. The 2 pieces fell between them on the frozen path. The garden was very still. Somewhere above the walls, a cloud moved across the partial moon and the light shifted. "There is one more thing," Mara said. She looked down at the sleeping boys. She looked at Rowan's jaw, visible above the edge of the wrap, the jaw she had spent 5 years not looking at directly in lamplight. She looked back at Kaelin. "They're yours," she said. The silence was absolute. She watched him look at the children. Really look, not the polite attention he had paid in the garden 2 days ago, not the careful observation of a king cataloging something interesting. This was different. This was his wolf reaching the surface of his eyes and staying there, raw and unguarded and stripped of every layer of courtly composure he had spent years constructing. His hand came up. He reached toward Rowan's face and stopped, his fingers an inch from the boy's cheek, hovering. He did not touch him. He understood, without being told, that waking them was not part of this. His hand dropped. He turned to her, and his expression was the most undefended thing she had ever seen on a king's face. He reached for her. She stepped back one pace. "I am not here for a reunion," she said. Her voice was level. She needed it to be level. "I am here because your sons deserve to exist in the open, and because Seraphine has been running your court on a curse she purchased 5 years ago." The quality of his attention changed. "What?" he said. "The sterility. It's not a natural condition. I recognized the bloodwork signature the week I started working in the Royal Infirmary. I have spent 5 years studying that class of curse specifically because I needed to understand what had been done to you." She commissioned it before the choosing ceremony. "There is a rogue witch's catalog that documents the commission structure. There will be transaction records." He was very still. "She wanted you unable to produce an heir," Mara said. "A king without succession needs his queen's political alliances. He cannot afford to remove her." A sound came from the deep shadow near the garden wall. Small, involuntary. The sound of a person who has been holding very still, realizing they have moved too much. Kaelin's head turned. His eyes found the shadow with the speed of an alpha who had stopped pretending to be anything else. The figure at the wall went rigid and then turned and ran, footsteps rapid on the stone, already heading toward the west wing, toward Seraphine. Kaelin looked back at Mara. The courtly composure was completely gone now. What remained was something older and more certain. The king stripped down to the wolf, and the wolf already moving through the problem with the clarity of an animal that does not waste time. He reached out and took her hand, not gently, not tenderly. The grip of someone establishing a coordinate. "We have until she reaches her receiving room," he said. "Can you walk fast with the boys?" "I have been walking fast with the boys," Mara said, "for 5 years. Something crossed his face. It was not quite a smile. It was something that might have been a smile, in a different hour, under different circumstances. He did not let go of her hand. Fenwick's medical office smelled of camphor and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where someone had been working too long without opening a window. The twins were asleep on the narrow examination cot, pressed together in the unconscious solidarity of children who had always shared a small space. And Mara sat across from Kaelin in the lamplight and laid out everything she knew. She had been preparing this for 5 years. Not consciously, not with any plan to ever use it. But the knowledge had accumulated anyway, the way a healer's knowledge always did. Through the relentless habit of needing to understand what had been done and how and whether it could be undone. She had studied the curse because it was there in his bloodwork, and she could not leave an unanswered question alone. She had studied it until she could name every component and trace every element back to its source. She named it now. Fenwick had gone very still. He was standing at his filing cabinet with one drawer open and his hand resting on it, and he was not moving. "The compound affects reproductive function at the cellular level," she said. "The signature is unmistakable once you know the witch's catalog. She favors a particular binding agent. It leaves a specific marker in the bloodwork that degrades slowly over years. Yours." She looked at Kaelin, held the word steady. "Still shows it. Faintly, after 5 years, but it is there." "You recognized it when you reviewed my files," Kaelin said. Not a question. "The first week in the Royal Infirmary." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp on Fenwick's desk threw a low, warm light across the cot where his son slept, and she watched him look at them before he looked back at her. "Fenwick," he said. "I reached the same conclusion 8 months ago," Fenwick said, from the cabinet. His voice was the careful voice of a man confessing something he had been carrying in silence for too long. "I lacked corroboration, and the implications of being wrong about a crowned queen." He stopped. "The first, am not proud of that." "The transaction records," Kaelin said to Mara. "Commission ledgers. Rogue witches of this classification keep them as insurance. They're the only leverage they have against powerful clients. Kingdom law admits them as evidence in criminal proceedings." She had looked that up 4 years ago, sitting in a mountain clinic at 2 a.m. with a law compendium borrowed from the village magistrate. A high-born client commissioning a targeted fertility curse 5 years ago would leave a clear trail, if you know where to look for the broker. I know the broker's name. Kaelin stood. He moved to the door, opened it, and said something brief to the guard outside. Mara heard a name, Aldrich. She filed it away. Fenwick crossed the room and sat down heavily in his chair. He looked at Mara with the expression of a man revising a significant number of prior assumptions. "You came here for this," he said. "I came here for my sons," she said. This is what needed to happen so they could stay. The distinction mattered to her. She needed him to understand it. The room settled into a working quiet, Fenwick pulling the archived bloodwork files she had referenced by date and case number, stacking them on the desk with the methodical efficiency of someone grateful to have something concrete to do. Mara organized her notes. The twins slept on, Rowan's arm thrown over Eli's shoulder with the proprietary ease of a boy who had always considered his brother a legitimate pillow. Kaylin came back into the room and sat across from her again. The distance between them across the desk was 2 feet and entirely insufficient. Her wolf had been making low, continuous sounds in the back of her mind since the garden, sounds she was firmly not listening to. But their proximity in this small room made the bond pull like a tide against a wall she was still not ready to take down. Not yet. Not today. Today had enough in it already. "What do you need from me?" he said, quietly. Just the two of them, in the lamp-warm space between the desk and the sleeping children. She looked at him directly. She let herself do that, for once. "I need the full council convened before she can reach them first," she said. "She will have started calling in debts the moment her hunter reported back. If she gets to the noble houses before you call the session, she can frame the narrative and we lose the room before we've spoken a word." He held her gaze. "I can call a session within 2 hours. Then we have 2 hours to be ready." He nodded. He started to speak again. She could see it building, something other than strategy, something that had been sitting behind his eyes since the garden, and she looked deliberately back at her notes, because she was not ready for that either. Not in this room. Not with Fenwick present and the boys asleep 3 feet away, and Seraphine already moving in the west wing. The door opened. A broad man in a security captain's coat entered with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked into difficult situations professionally for 30 years. He looked at Mara. He looked at Kaylin. He made no comment on the sleeping children, or the pre-dawn hour, or the nature of any of it. "The broker," Mara said, and gave him the name. Aldrich looked at her for exactly 1 second with an expression that communicated something between professional respect and deep personal relief. Then he was gone. The wait was 47 minutes. When the door opened again, Aldrich held a leather-bound ledger in one hand. He set it on the desk and opened it to a tabbed page and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The entry was there in a broker's careful hand, dated 5 years and 3 days ago. The client's name was Seraphine Ashwell. The silver throne room was the largest space in the palace, built to hold a full court and the full weight of whatever a king needed to make permanent. Morning light came through the high windows in long, pale columns, falling across the council table and the assembled noble houses and the rows of courtiers standing at the room's edges. The air smelled of cold stone and beeswax, and the particular tension of people who had been summoned without sufficient warning and did not yet know why. Mara stood to Kaylin's left, 3 paces back. That was her choice. She had dressed in the royal infirmary uniform the best she had, and she had pinned her hair back with the precision of a woman preparing for a procedure she could not afford to have go wrong. Her notes were in her hands. Her wolf was very quiet, conserving itself for what came next. Seraphine arrived 7 minutes into the session. She was, as always, immaculate. She took her seat at the council table with the unhurried composure of someone who had decided, on the way here, exactly how this was going to go. She looked at Mara once, a brief, assessing look. Then she looked at Kaylin. "I understand," she said to the assembled council, "that there has been some confusion about a palace servant. I am glad the council has been convened. This situation has a simple resolution." She was good. Mara had known she would be. The next 4 minutes confirmed. Seraphine laid out the case with the calm authority of a woman who had been managing rooms like this for years. Fraudulent entry, forged documentation, a rejected Omega with a clear motive, surfacing after 5 years with accusations calculated to destabilize the crown at its most vulnerable moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room was wavering. Mara could feel it, the particular collective lean of people who wanted to believe the simpler story because the simpler story was safer. She did not wait for permission. "Council Physician Heron," she said. Every head turned. Seraphine's gaze moved to her with the focused stillness of a cat that has just seen something unexpected move. Mara addressed the council physician directly, the way she would address a colleague presenting a complex case. "I want to walk you through a bloodwork pattern," she said. "The relevant files are Fenwick archive cases dated the 14th and 22nd of Ash month 5 years ago, cross-referenced against the current royal panel from 3 months prior. You have copies in front of you." A pause. Papers rustled. Heron, an older man with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades not committing to opinions before he had the evidence, looked down at the documents Fenwick had placed at each council seat before the session began. Mara named the curse. She named its structure. She described the specific binding agent, the cellular signature it left behind, and the rate at which that signature degraded over time. She cited Fenwick's archived measurements by date and numerical value, tracking the slow decay of a compound introduced 5 years ago. She described how she had recognized the pattern and how any trained physician could verify her analysis independently in this room, today, with the materials already in front of them. "I invite any council physician to do so," she said. "I will wait." Heron was already writing. Seraphine's voice came in, smooth and controlled. "This is precisely the kind of elaborate fabrication, Aldrich," Kaelin said. Aldrich set the ledger on the council table. He opened it to the tabbed page. He stepped back. The room read what was written there. Mara watched the information move through the assembled faces like a current moving through water, slow at first, then faster, then all at once. Seraphine went still, not the practiced stillness she wore like armor. Something else, the stillness of a structure finding the point at which it could no longer hold. "The title," Kaelin said, "is stripped, effective immediately. Aldrich." It was over in under a minute. The palace guard moved. Seraphine did not speak again. She walked out with her back straight and her chin level, and Mara gave her that, because there was no version of this moment worth gloating over. Something simply had to end. The room erupted. Council members were on their feet. Voices crossed each other in competing directions. Questions, protests, demands for clarification. Mara stood in the center of it and understood, with the particular clarity of exhaustion, that she had done what she came to do. She turned toward the side door. She had her sons to collect. She had Fenwick to thank. She had the boys' things still half-packed in the servant quarters, and she should retrieve them before anyone thought to seal the room. The old instinct moved through her cleanly, the way it always did when a crisis resolved. Find the practical next step. Put your head down. Become invisible again until the situation was stable. 10 strides. That was how far she got. His hands came around her face from behind both of them, warm and certain and carrying no trace of hesitation whatsoever. He turned her gently. She had one breath, one single breath, to see his expression before he bit. The bond did not open. It detonated. Every wolf in the room felt it. She felt them feel it. A wave of recognition so complete and so physical that 2 council members actually staggered, grabbing the table for balance. The pull in her chest that had lived underground for 5 years came fully, blazingly, irrevocably to the surface, and her wolf, her furious, patient, long-suffering wolf, finally went completely and entirely silent. Not suppressed, not restrained. Satisfied, she bit him back, at his throat, where the scent of him was strongest, where she had been trying for 14 days not to look. She felt the bond complete on his end, with the same devastating certainty. A lock finding its key, a river finding its bed, something clicking into place that had been straining against displacement for 5 years. She stepped back. She looked at him. He looked back. No performance, no king's face, just Kaelin. The door opened. Fenwick appeared with Rowan on one hip and Eli's hand in his, both boys awake and wide-eyed and deeply interested in the quality of the chaos around them. Kaelin turned. He went to his sons without hurrying. and he took them both, one in each arm, and stood with them in the morning light coming through the high windows of the silver throne room. Rowan immediately attempted to identify everything in the room at high volume. Eli leaned his head against his father's shoulder with the peaceful certainty of a child who had always known, somehow, how this was supposed to feel. Kaelin did not try to control his expression. The room went quiet, and then, one by one, beginning with Heron and moving outward through the council and the courtiers and the guards at the door, every person in the silver throne room dropped to one knee. 1 year later, the silver throne court smelled of summer. Open windows let in the warmth and the sound of the courtyard below children's voices, the distant clang of the training yard, the particular rhythm of a palace that had remembered how to breathe. The rosemary in the herb garden had come back thick and fragrant after the winter. Mara had noted this with professional satisfaction, and then spent an afternoon teaching Rowan why it mattered, which had led to an extended debate about whether healing plants should also be interesting, in which Rowan held strong opinions on both sides simultaneously. She was still the kingdom's head healer. She was also the queen. She had told Kaelin at the beginning that she would not choose between the roles, and he had said simply, "Good," and meant it. The court had adjusted. Courts, she had learned, adjusted to whatever they were given if the person at the center was sufficiently certain. Mara was certain about very few things in a general sense, but about medicine and about her sons, she was immovable, and the court had arranged itself accordingly. Fenwick had named the new bloodwork protocol after her analysis. She had told him it was unnecessary. He had told her that was not, in fact, her decision. They had reached an agreement. Edric was a sergeant now. He had been promoted twice in 12 months, which Mara suspected had something to do with the way Kaelin felt about loyalty demonstrated in small, unwitnessed moments. She had sent Edric a good joint tincture when his knee flared in the cold. He had sent back a note that said only, "Thank you," as if they were still the same two people on either side of a checkpoint 4 years ago. And she supposed in the ways that mattered they were. Seraphine was in the Eastern Territories. Exile, not imprisonment. Mara had argued for it, not out of forgiveness but out of the particular clarity that came from being a healer first. Cages, she had told the council, created nothing but the conditions for the next problem. They had agreed in the end, with the cautious relief of people who wanted to believe they were capable of mercy. She was in the herb garden at dusk when she heard Kaelin's footsteps on the path. She knew them by now. The particular weight and rhythm, the unhurried pace of a man who had stopped needing to brace himself before entering rooms. He came through the gate and sat beside her in the fading light, without announcing himself, without asking permission. Rowan was explaining something to Eli with great urgency about the relative merits of rosemary versus thyme. Eli was listening with the patient expression that meant he had already reached his own conclusion and was allowing the process to run its course. Kaelin sat close enough that his shoulder touched hers. She remembered the first time she had stood in this garden. The way she had kept her back to him, her hands on the herbs, every muscle in her body focused on the single task of not turning around. The way his footsteps had sounded then like something she could not afford to want. She turned to look at him now because she could, because there was no cost to it anymore, because the bond between them, completed and settled and deeply, quietly permanent, had made looking at him one of the simplest things she did each day. He was already looking at her. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. In the courtyard beyond the wall, the evening bells began their count, and Rowan's argument reached its crescendo and collapsed into comfortable silence, and the late summer light moved slowly through the garden, the way it did when the days were long and the world was, for once, exactly what it show. LDB. His wolf had nothing left to say. After 6 years of searching, of howling at distances and silences and closed doors, it was completely, entirely still. So was hers. Thank you so much for spending this time with Mara and Kaelin. If their story moved you, I would love to know in the comments. Your words genuinely mean the world. If you're new here, there are more stories like this one waiting for you on this channel, and I hope you'll stay. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Destined love always finds its way home.